2020, when the COVID happened, and that's when I went under all my businesses, and I had to retrench 219 staff. When I retrenched 219 staff, I was going through a hell. And that time I had logistic company as well. But there was a time when I was reading a book. This is the first book that I was reading. And in this book, it was, I think, Billy Graham. In that book, he was talking about, he was actually teaching about the earthquakes and the magnitude of the earthquakes. And somehow he was giving examples to say some certain earthquakes, if they hit here, you most of the time you will get lost. And then when he was busy teaching and giving examples and types of earthquakes, and then something struck my mind, and that was just more than enough to blow my mind. And then he said, then he stopped the whole thing, he paused, and then he focused on the survivors of the earthquakes. And then he said most of the time the survivors of the earthquakes, they lose sense of direction. And then because everything will be buried under the rubble, and you can see Horomo Nele Soshanguve crossing or Monele TUT, but everything is under the rubble. But now you get lost, you don't understand, or where am I? And then he said there was a guy who was lost after a very catastrophic earthquake, and then the guy, he found himself lost, and he was walking around the mountains. Then he met a very old man, and he said to him, I'm lost, but somehow I grew up here. I don't know where I am. And that old man gave him the advice of his life. And then he said to him, you know what? If you find yourself lost again in the mountains, even in the future, you don't go down. Always go up. I think that was the first time, because I don't read books. That was the first book that
you actually
made me to read more books. Yes. And then you don't go down, but we all have choices. It's either you go down, you succumb to the pressure, and you feel like you are in the pit of despair, and now you feel like throwing your hands in the air. Most of them, they give up, and that's what I get, depression. And
depression.
And then, but now he said the other choice, the other option that we have, it does not matter how difficult it is. He said you can choose also to go up, because when you are at the reach of the mountain, that's when you will see clearly. So that was the first book. But actually that book, now the first book that gave me the skill, it was the book called by Jim Collins. It's a management book. It's a book called How the Mighty Fall. And that book actually taught me about the stages of decline. It's either in your life, in your career, or in an organization. If maybe you are at the pinnacle of the corporate ladder and somehow you are responsible for running this big organization, and then the book, it's self-diagnostic. It teaches you how to self-diagnose your organization, your business. Remember, this time it was when everything went under. I lost all my businesses. I retrenched almost everyone. I lost my trucks. I lost everything. Yes. And I was going through some litigations. Remember, facing 219 employees at CCMA, and all these kind of things. And I lost my trucks. I was fighting with Asset for Future Unit in Polokwane, the Hawks and everyone. You can imagine. So now I had to now go down, and then I lost everything. That was the biggest downfall. Now the book, what the book taught me, and then it was teaching about or how these big companies, that some of them, they had some market cap of trillions or billions of US dollars. How did they go under? And then it was teaching about those mistakes. That was the first book. And the second book that I read, then after I bounced back, because I had to reinvent myself. There was a day when I was so angry, and I said, you know what? I don't have a choice. I just need to bounce back. Now, after I bounced back, then I read the book called, by the same author, anyway, Great by Choice.
Fan of that author?
Yes, Jim Collins. It's a management book. It's not just an ordinary book. It's a book. It's a research work. And now the book, they researched it. I think it took them some 11 years or so, but they researched thousands, or not hundreds, of companies. They were going through thousands and thousands, if not millions of pages, and then trying to understand how or why other companies they do tick and others they're so great, but others they fail. You find that the environment is the